"So this is your price?" she said, her voice smooth enough to sound like kindness, sharp enough to cut through a man's pride. The check lay between them on the worn wooden counter, crisp, untouched, its numbers longer than anything Daniel Hayes had seen tied to his name in years. Around them, the garage buzzed softly with the hum of fluorescent lights and the ticking of a cooling engine, but no one spoke, because moments like this didn't need noise, they demanded silence. Daniel didn't reach for the check. He didn't even look at it right away. Instead, he wiped his hands slowly on a faded shop rag, the kind that had seen more honest work than most men ever would. "Take it," Victoria Hale added, tilting her head just slightly, studying him the way someone studies a problem they already think they've solved. "It's more than you'll make in 5 years here." A couple of customers standing near the open bay door shifted their weight, pretending not to listen, but every eye was fixed on the scene. They knew her name. Everyone did. Billionaire CEO. The kind of woman who bought companies before breakfast and sold them by dinner. And they knew him too. Just Daniel. Just a single dad with grease under his nails and a quiet way of carrying himself like he didn't owe the world an explanation. He finally glanced down at the check, just once, like a man acknowledging a storm without stepping into it. The number was real. Life-changing. The kind of number that could fix everything people said was broken about his life. The kind of number that could buy safety, comfort, maybe even a future that didn't feel so tight around the edges. Victoria watched closely, waiting for the moment every other man gave in. The flicker of hunger, the small crack in dignity. It never came. Daniel folded the rag once, then again, deliberate, steady, like he was finishing something important. Then he slid the check back across the counter. Not forcefully, not dramatically, just enough. "I'm not for sale," he said, his voice low, even, carrying farther than it should have in a room that had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. A mechanic dropped a wrench somewhere in the back, the metallic clink echoing like punctuation. Victoria's smile didn't disappear, but it changed, less amused now, more curious, like she had just discovered. A variable she hadn't accounted for. "Everyone has a number," she replied, softer this time. Daniel met her gaze, not challenging, not afraid, just present. "Then I guess I'm not everyone." The words didn't rise. They settled. And in that moment, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way truth always does when it finally has room to stand. Outside, a pickup truck rolled past, tires crunching over gravel, life continuing like it always had. But inside that small garage, under flickering lights and the faint smell of motor oil, a different kind of transaction had just taken place. One where money lost, and something far rarer held its ground. Victoria picked up the check slowly, her fingers lingering on the paper as if it had suddenly become heavier than before. She didn't argue. She didn't push. She simply looked at him for a second longer than necessary, as if memorizing something she didn't fully understand yet. Then she turned and walked out into the afternoon sun, heels clicking softly against the concrete. No one spoke until the sound faded. And even then, no one laughed, no one questioned, because deep down, they all felt it, the kind of moment that doesn't announce itself, but stays with you anyway. The kind that doesn't change everything all at once, but makes it inevitable. The garage felt different after she left, not louder, not quieter, just heavier, like the air itself had taken note of what had happened and decided to stay with it a while. Daniel Hayes returned to his workbench without a word, picking up a wrench and tightening a bolt that did not really need tightening, his movements steady, controlled, the kind of rhythm a man learns when he chooses peace over reaction. "You really turned that down?" one of the younger mechanics finally asked, his voice caught somewhere between disbelief and admiration. Daniel did not look up. "I turned down the part that did not feel right," he replied simply, and that was all he offered, because some decisions are not meant to be explained, only lived with. By the time the sun dipped lower, casting long amber shadows across the concrete floor, the garage had emptied out, leaving behind only the faint scent of oil and warm metal. Daniel locked up, the click of the door echoing softly into the quiet evening, and made his way to his truck, an old Ford that started on the second try if you treated it with patience. The drive home was short, just under 3 miles along a narrow road lined with tired trees and modest houses, the kind of place where people knew your name, but not your story. Inside his small home, the world shifted again. The harsh edges of the day softened into something gentler, something real. "Daddy, you are late," Lily called from the kitchen table, her voice bright, her feet swinging just above the floor as she colored carefully inside the lines of a picture that did not need perfection to be beautiful. Daniel set his keys down and smiled, a quiet kind of smile that never needed to prove itself. "Had a busy afternoon," he said, washing his hands at the sink, watching the water carry away the grease and dust, but not the weight of the choices he had made. "Did you fix everything?" she asked, looking up at him with the kind of trust only a child can give. He paused for a second, drying his hands slowly. "Not everything," he answered, his tone calm, steady, "but the things that matter." Lily nodded as if that made complete sense, because to her, it did. Dinner was simple, grilled cheese and tomato soup, the kind of meal that filled more than just hunger. The kitchen light hummed softly above them, casting a warm glow that felt far removed from polished offices and million-dollar conversations. "Mrs. Carter said some kids are going to a new private school next year," Lily said between bites, her voice careful, testing the edges of something she did not fully understand. "It is supposed to be really nice." Daniel listened, not interrupting, not rushing to answer. He had learned that sometimes the best thing a father can give is space for a child's thoughts to land. "Do you want that?" he asked gently. Lily shrugged, her small shoulders rising and falling like she was not sure she was allowed to want something like that. "I just like learning," she said. Daniel nodded, his gaze softening, because in that moment, the number on that check came back to him, not as temptation, but as a question. What kind of future could it have bought? And more importantly, what kind of man would he have had to become to accept it? He reached across the table and tapped her paper lightly. "You keep doing that," he said, "and you will go anywhere you want." The house settled into its usual quiet after dinner, the kind that did not feel empty, just honest. Outside, the night air cooled, and somewhere in the distance, a car passed by without slowing down. Daniel stood by the window for a moment, looking out into the dark, not searching for anything, not expecting anything, just standing in the space he had chosen for himself. He did not know that somewhere across town, in a world of glass towers and silent elevators, a woman who had never been told no without consequence was sitting very still, replaying a moment she could not quite explain. And in that quiet distance between them, something had already begun to move, not loudly, not urgently, but with the kind of certainty that does not need permission to change a life. The next morning arrived without ceremony, just a pale stretch of light slipping through the blinds and settling quietly across the worn kitchen floor, the kind of morning that does not announce change, but carries it anyway. Daniel Hayes was already awake before the alarm, sitting at the edge of his bed with his hands clasped loosely, not in worry, not in regret, just in thought. Some decisions echo louder the day after, not because they were wrong, but because they were real. By 7:30, the garage doors rolled open with their usual groan, metal against metal, a sound that had become part of the neighborhood's rhythm. The smell of motor oil and dust greeted him like an old friend, familiar and honest. "Morning, boss," one of the mechanics called out, a little more careful than usual, as if yesterday had shifted something they could not quite name. Daniel nodded, setting his coffee down on the same corner of the workbench he always used. "Let us get to it," he said, simple, steady, because work did not wait for reflection. The first hour passed like any other, engines checked, tires rotated, small conversations that stayed safely on the surface. But just after 9, a black SUV rolled slowly into the lot, its polished surface catching the morning light in a way that did not belong there. Conversations paused. Tools slowed. It was not just the vehicle. It was the presence that came with it. A man stepped out, dressed in a tailored suit that looked like it had never known a wrinkle, holding a leather folder close to his side like it contained something more than paper. He did not rush. Men like him never did. "Daniel Hayes?" he asked, his tone professional, neutral, the kind that did not ask questions without already knowing the answer. Daniel wiped his hands and walked forward, his pace unhurried, his posture unchanged. "That is me," he replied. The man opened the folder and extended a document, crisp, precise, everything about it intentional. "I represent Hale Industries," he said, letting the name sit in the air for just a moment longer than necessary. A few mechanics exchanged glances. They knew that name too. Everyone did. We would like to make a formal offer to acquire this property and all associated operations. The terms are very competitive. He slid the paper forward slightly, not pushing, just presenting, as if the outcome was already expected. Daniel did not take it immediately. He looked at the document, then at the man, then briefly at the garage around him, the chipped paint, the tools that had been repaired more times than replaced, the space where his life had unfolded one quiet decision at a time. You came early, Daniel said, not as an accusation, just an observation. The man gave a small, polite smile. We value efficiency. A pause followed, thin but noticeable. And we believe timing matters. Daniel reached out then, but not to accept, only to steady the paper for a moment, his fingers resting lightly against it as if measuring its weight without lifting it. And what happens to the people who work here? He asked, his voice even, but now carrying something deeper beneath it. The man did not hesitate. They would be reviewed. Some may be retained under new management. The words were clean, practiced, and carefully empty. Behind Daniel, someone shifted their feet. Another mechanic set down a tool a little too softly, trying not to make a sound. Daniel nodded once, slow, thoughtful, like a man placing a piece on a board he had already studied. I see, he said. He let go of the paper, allowing it to rest untouched between them. The morning light shifted slightly, casting a longer shadow across the floor. And in that quiet space, without raising his voice, without adding weight to the moment, Daniel made something clear again, not just to the man in the suit, but to everyone listening. Then you came to the wrong place. The man blinked once, not offended, just recalibrating, like someone who had expected resistance, but not certainty. I understand, he said after a moment, closing the folder with careful precision. We will remain in contact. Daniel nodded, already turning back toward the workbench, because some conversations do not need a second round. The SUV pulled away as quietly as it had arrived, leaving behind a stillness that lingered just a little longer than before. And though nothing had been signed, nothing had changed on paper, something had shifted again, deeper this time, like the beginning of a test that was not about money, but about how much a man was willing to hold on to when the world kept asking him to let go. By the third day, the pressure did not arrive loudly. It arrived politely, in envelopes and phone calls and quiet interruptions that carried the weight of something larger moving behind the scenes. Daniel Hayes noticed it first in the small things, the kind most people would overlook. A supplier he had worked with for years suddenly hesitated on a delivery. We are reviewing our contracts, the man said over the phone, his voice careful, distant, like someone choosing each word with too much thought. Daniel did not argue. I understand, he replied, because sometimes understanding is not agreement, it is simply awareness. Later that morning, a city inspector walked into the garage, clipboard in hand, expression neutral but firm. Routine compliance check, he said, though the timing felt anything but routine. The mechanics straightened a little, movements slowing as eyes drifted toward Daniel, waiting to see how he would respond. Daniel stepped forward calmly, wiping his hands on that same faded rag. Everything you need is here, he said, gesturing toward the workspace, his voice steady, not defensive, not welcoming, just grounded. The inspector nodded and began his walkthrough, checking details that had always been there, but suddenly seemed to matter more. The hum of the garage softened into something tighter, like the room itself was holding its breath. A loose shelf bracket was noted. A faded safety label was written down. Small things. Always small things. But small things, repeated. Enough, begin to feel like something else. You will receive a notice, the inspector said after a while, closing his clipboard with a soft click that echoed more than it should have. Daniel nodded once. Thank you for your time. No argument. No frustration. Just a quiet acceptance that did not mean surrender. By noon, the air had shifted again. Fewer customers came in. A regular who usually stopped by every Friday drove past without slowing down, his eyes fixed ahead like he had somewhere else to be. One of the younger mechanics approached Daniel, uncertainty written across his face. You think this is about that woman? He asked, his voice low, almost cautious, like saying it out loud might make it more real. Daniel tightened a bolt, then another, finishing what he started before answering. I think, he said slowly, that sometimes people use pressure to see what moves. The mechanic frowned. And if nothing moves? Daniel looked up then, his expression calm, almost thoughtful. Then they learned something they did not expect. The words settled quietly between them. No bravado, no defiance, just truth. As the afternoon stretched on, the sunlight shifted through the open bay door, casting longer shadows across the concrete floor, shadows that seemed to stretch with the tension in the air. Inside an office miles away, behind glass walls and silent elevators, Victoria Hale stood looking out over the city, her reflection faint against the skyline. "Any response?" she asked without turning, her voice composed, controlled, but carrying a thread of something sharper beneath it. "No, ma'am," her assistant replied. "He is not engaged." A pause followed, not long, but deliberate. Victoria's fingers rested lightly against the edge of the desk, her posture still, her mind moving. "Increase the review cycle," she said quietly. "Nothing excessive, just thorough." The assistant nodded. "Of course." Back at the garage, Daniel stood alone for a moment as the day began to wind down, the sounds of work fading into the background. He looked around at the space he had built, not perfect, not polished, but honest. The kind of place that did not bend easily because it had been shaped slowly, with intention. He exhaled once, steady, not tired, not defeated, just aware. Because this was no longer about an offer. It was about something deeper now, something quieter, something that asked a simple question without ever speaking it out loud. How much pressure does it take before a man forgets who he is? And in that stillness, without anyone watching, without anyone asking, Daniel Hayes answered the only way he knew how. He picked up his tools and kept working. The fifth day came with a quiet kind of weight, the kind that does not press down all at once, but settles slowly into every corner of a man's life, until even the smallest choices begin to feel heavier than they should. Daniel Hayes noticed it before he even opened the garage, standing for a moment outside the door, keys in hand, the early morning air cool against his face as if reminding him that not everything needed to rush. Inside, the space felt the same, but the work did not. Fewer cars, longer gaps between customers, conversations that ended quicker than they began. By mid-morning, one of his oldest clients walked in, hat in hand, eyes not quite meeting Daniel's. "I think I am going to try that new place down the highway," he said, his voice careful, almost apologetic. "Heard they have better rates now." Daniel nodded once, no resistance, no persuasion. "You should go where it works best for you," he replied, because dignity does not beg to be chosen. The man hesitated, then gave a small nod before leaving, the bell above the door ringing softer than usual as it closed behind him. The sound lingered longer than it should have. Around noon, Daniel stepped outside to take a call, his voice low, steady. When he returned, something in his expression had shifted, not broken, not shaken, just quieter, like a man carrying a thought he had not yet decided to share. One of the mechanics noticed. "Everything all right?" he asked. Daniel set his phone down gently on the workbench. "School sent a notice," he said. "Tuition adjustment. They want it settled by the end of the month." The mechanic frowned. "That is soon." Daniel nodded. "Yes, it is." No complaint, no frustration, just fact. The room fell into a brief silence, not uncomfortable, just aware. Because everyone there understood what that meant. Not in numbers, but in weight. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to dip and the light softened into a warm, fading gold, a familiar black car rolled slowly into the lot again. This time, no hesitation. No announcement. The engine shut off, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened, and Victoria Hale stepped out, her presence as composed as ever, but something in her pace had changed. Slower, more deliberate. She walked toward Daniel, heels clicking lightly against the concrete, each step measured, not for effect, but for control. The garage grew still around them, not from fear, but from attention. "You are persistent," she said, her voice calm, but carrying something beneath it that was harder to read now. Daniel wiped his hands, meeting her gaze without shifting his stance. "So are you," he replied. A brief pause followed, thin and quiet, like the space between two truths waiting to be acknowledged. Victoria studied him for a moment, longer than before, as if searching for something she had not yet found. Then she reached into her bag and placed a new document on the counter, this one thicker, more detailed, the edges sharp and precise. "Final offer," she said simply. Enough to secure your future. Your daughter's future. No conditions on how you spend it. Just a signature. The words were clean, direct, and for the first time, not wrapped in performance. Around them, the world seemed to narrow slightly, the sounds of the street fading into the background. Daniel looked at the document, then at her, then back again, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the paper, not claiming it, not rejecting it yet, just acknowledging its presence. You did your research, he said quietly. Victoria did not deny it. I always do. Another pause. This one deeper. Because now the test had changed. This was no longer about pride. This was about need. About a father standing at the edge of something that could make his child's life easier, safer, more certain. The kind of choice that does not come often, and when it does not ask twice. Daniel exhaled slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of clarity. He slid the document back toward her, just as he had before, the motion steady, unforced, undeniable. My daughter does not need a future built on something I cannot stand behind, he said, his voice low but firm, carrying through the room with a quiet strength that did not need volume. No one spoke. No one moved. Victoria did not reach for the document immediately this time. She simply looked at him, really looked, as if for the first time she was not measuring his value, but understanding it. And in that moment, something shifted again, not in him, but in her. Because for the third time, when it would have been easier, when it would have made more sense, when it would have solved more than it risked, Daniel Hayes chose the one thing she had never been able to buy. Himself. Victoria Hale did not respond right away, and that silence carried more weight than any argument she could have made. The document remained between them, untouched, as if even paper could sense that something larger had just taken place. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly, steady and indifferent, while the rest of the world seemed to step back and wait. Daniel Hayes had already turned slightly, not dismissing her, not avoiding her, simply returning to himself, to the space where his choices were made without audience or approval. For a long moment, Victoria stood there, her posture composed, her expression unreadable, but her eyes no longer sharp with calculation. They were searching now, not for leverage, but for meaning. Do you always make things this difficult? She asked finally, her voice quieter than before, stripped of its earlier edge. Daniel picked up a tool, adjusted a loose fitting with deliberate care, then set it down before answering. Only when it matters, he said. The words did not challenge her. They grounded the moment. Around them, the mechanics moved slowly, respectfully, not out of fear, but because something in the air asked for it. Victoria exhaled, almost imperceptibly, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the document before she pulled it back toward herself. No frustration, no force, just a decision forming. You could have made this easy, she said, more to herself than to him. Daniel gave a small nod. Easy is not always right. Another silence followed, deeper this time, not empty, but full of something unspoken that neither of them rushed to name. Outside, the late afternoon light softened, casting long shadows that stretched across the garage floor like quiet reminders of time, moving forward whether people were ready or not. Victoria closed the folder slowly, the sound soft but final, and for a brief second, she did not move. Then she looked at him again, not as a businessman looks at a deal, but as a person looks at something rare they did not expect to find. You are not what I thought, she said. Daniel did not smile. He did not take pride in it. Most people are not, he replied. That was all. No explanation. No expansion. Just truth, offered without decoration. Victoria nodded once, a small, almost reluctant acknowledgement, as if something inside her had shifted in a way she could not fully control. Then perhaps, she said slowly, I was asking the wrong question. Daniel paused, just for a moment, then met her gaze again. That happens, he said, calm, steady, leaving space for her to find her own answer. She studied him one last time, longer than before, as if committing something to memory, not his face, not his words, but the way he stood without needing anything from her. And then, without another word, she turned and walked toward her car, her steps quieter now, less precise, more human. The engine started, low and smooth, and within seconds, she was gone, the black car disappearing down the road without drawing attention to itself. No announcement. No conclusion. just absence. Inside the garage, the tension eased slowly, like a held breath finally released. One of the mechanics looked toward Daniel, waiting for some kind of reaction, some sign that the moment had meant something more. Daniel simply picked up his tools again and returned to work, the rhythm of metal and motion grounding him back into the life he had chosen. But as the sun dipped lower and the shadows deepened, something lingered in the quiet. Not pressure, not doubt, but possibility. Because for the first time since this began, the test had changed. It was no longer about whether Daniel Hayes would bend. That answer had already been given. Now, without anyone saying it out loud, a different question waited in the silence. What would she do next, now that she had finally met something money could not move? 3 days passed without announcement, without warning, the kind of quiet stretch that makes people believe the storm has already moved on, when in truth it is only gathering itself somewhere out of sight. On the 4th morning, Daniel Hayes arrived at the garage earlier than usual, the sky still pale and undecided between night and day, the air carrying that faint chill that lingers just before the sun commits. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and paused for a moment, not out of concern, but out of instinct, because something felt different. Not wrong, just waiting. By 8 o'clock, the first sound came, not from inside, but from the road. Low at first, distant, like a hum that did not belong to the usual rhythm of the neighborhood. Then another, and another. Engines. Smooth, synchronized, deliberate. One of the mechanics stepped outside, wiping his hands on a rag, squinting into the morning light. "Hey, you might want to see this," he called back, his voice carrying a note that had not been there before. Daniel walked out, calm as ever, his pace unhurried, but his eyes attentive. Down the narrow road leading to the garage, a line of vehicles approached, not fast, not loud, just precise. Black sedans. 2 SUVs. Clean, polished, unmistakably out of place against the worn pavement and modest buildings that lined the street. They did not stop all at once. They arrived one by one, spacing themselves with intention, until the lot was filled with a quiet kind of presence that did not need explanation to be understood. No one spoke. Even the air seemed to still. Doors opened almost in unison, and drivers stepped out, each dressed with the same careful professionalism, each holding something in their hands. Not contracts. Not folders. Keys. One of them approached Daniel, stopping at a respectful distance, not too close, not too far. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his tone measured, not superior, not submissive, simply clear. "We have been instructed to bring these vehicles to you." Daniel glanced at the line of cars, then back at the man, his expression unchanged. "For what purpose?" he asked. The man gave a small nod, as if expecting the question. "For service," he replied. A brief silence followed, not confusion, but recognition. Because this was not random. This was not coincidence. This was intention, just expressed differently now. Another driver stepped forward, holding out a set of keys. "All maintenance requests have been prepaid," he added. "No negotiation required." Behind Daniel, the mechanics had gathered, not crowding, just watching, their usual ease replaced by something quieter, something closer to respect. One of them whispered under his breath, "That is a lot of work." Daniel did not respond to that. He looked at the keys, then at the vehicles, then at the road where more could have come but did not need to. Everything that needed to be said was already here. "Who sent you?" he asked, though the answer had already formed in the silence. The man held his gaze, steady. "Ms. Hale." No title, no explanation, just a name, the kind that did not need anything else attached to it anymore. Daniel exhaled slowly, not in relief, not in surprise, but in understanding. Because this was no longer an offer. This was a choice. Not to control, not to pressure, but to respect. He reached out and took the first set of keys, his grip firm, grounded, the same way it had always been when he chose to accept something that aligned with who he was. "All right," he said simply. "We will take care of them." The words settled into the space like a quiet agreement, not spoken between two people, but between values that had finally met on equal ground. The drivers nodded, one by one, stepping back without lingering, without needing acknowledgement, because their role had already been fulfilled. Engines remained off. No one rushed to leave. And for a moment, the entire scene held still, like a photograph that captured something rare enough to matter. Then, slowly, the world resumed. Tools were picked up. Garage doors opened wider. Work began. Not louder, not faster, just fuller. And as Daniel Hayes turned toward the first car, rolling up his sleeves with that same quiet certainty, something settled into place, not as victory, not as reward, but as truth. Because sometimes, the strongest answer is not the one that speaks first. It is the one that stays the same until the world learns how to listen. The rhythm of the garage changed in the days that followed, not in noise, not in speed, but in weight, as if every turn of a wrench now carried a quiet sense of purpose that had not been there before. The line of vehicles did not disappear after that first morning. It continued, not overwhelming, not excessive, just steady, controlled, like someone had decided to invest not in ownership, but in trust. Daniel Hayes noticed it in the way his team moved, a little more confident, a little more grounded, not because the work was easier, but because it felt seen. By the end of the week, the garage was full again, not crowded, just alive, the way it used to be before pressure tried to reshape it into something else. That afternoon, as the sun filtered through the open bay door, soft and golden, a familiar car rolled in, not with an announcement, not with a line behind it, just alone. The engine cut quietly, and for a moment, no one moved, because some arrivals do not need attention to be understood. Victoria Hale stepped out, her presence no longer sharp against the environment, but integrated into it, like someone who had finally chosen to stand within a space instead of above it. Daniel looked up from the engine he was working on, his expression steady, his posture unchanged. He did not approach immediately. He finished tightening the bolt in front of him, wiped his hands, then walked toward her with the same calm pace he always carried. "You found your answer," he said, not as a question, but as recognition. Victoria held his gaze, and this time, there was no performance behind her eyes, no calculation, only clarity that had taken time to form. "No," she said softly. "I found the right question." A brief silence settled between them, not awkward, not tense, just real. The kind that allows truth to exist without interruption. She glanced around the garage, taking in the worn tools, the focused workers, the quiet rhythm that could not be bought or replicated. "I spent years believing control was the same as respect," she continued, her voice even, but quieter than before, like someone speaking not to impress, but to understand. "I thought if something had value, it could be acquired, measured, managed." Daniel listened without interrupting, his presence steady, giving her space to reach the end of her own thought. She looked back at him, and for the first time, there was no distance between who she was and what she was saying. "You showed me something I could not purchase," she said. "And for a while, I did not know what to do with that." Daniel gave a small nod, not as approval, but as acknowledgement. "Most people do not," he replied. The words were simple, but they carried weight, because they did not judge, they understood. Victoria exhaled slowly, as if letting go of something she had carried for longer than she realized. "I was not testing your business," she said. "I was testing your character." The admission did not land like a confession. It landed like truth finally catching up to itself. Around them, the garage continued its quiet work, no one stopping, no one staring, because respect does not need an audience. Daniel looked at her for a moment, then glanced briefly at the cars outside, at the work that had returned without conditions. "And what did you learn?" he asked. Victoria did not hesitate this time. "That character does not respond to pressure," she said. "It reveals itself through it." The words settled into the space between them, not heavy, not light, just complete. Daniel nodded once, his expression unchanged, but his eyes carrying a quiet recognition. Because some lessons do not belong to one person. They belong to the moment that created them. Victoria stepped slightly closer, not crossing a boundary, just narrowing the distance enough to speak as one person to another, not as power to resistance. "I am not here to buy anything anymore," she said. "I am here to ask if there is a place for me where I do not have to." The question hung gently in the air, not demanding, not urgent, just honest. And for the first time since this began, there was no test left in it. Only choice. Daniel Hayes did not answer her right away, and that pause carried more truth than any quick response ever could, because some questions are not meant to be answered with words, but with understanding. The garage continued its steady rhythm around them, tools moving, engines turning, quiet work filling the space like a heartbeat that never needed to announce itself. He looked at Victoria Hale for a long moment, not measuring her, not judging her, simply seeing her as she stood now, without the weight of titles or numbers standing between them. Then he glanced toward the open bay door, where the late afternoon light stretched across the concrete, warm and patient, touching everything without asking for permission. "There has always been a place," he said finally, his voice calm, even, grounded in something deeper than the moment itself. "Just not for the version of you that needed to control it." The words did not push her away. They made space. Victoria let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her shoulders softening slightly, not in defeat, but in release. Around them, nothing stopped, nothing paused, because real change does not interrupt the world, it moves quietly within it. "And now?" she asked, her voice lower, not uncertain, just honest. Daniel gave a small nod, the kind that did not promise anything it could not keep. "Now you can stay," he said. "But you stay as yourself. No conditions, no contracts, just truth. The kind that cannot be written down but can be lived." Victoria absorbed that slowly, the meaning settling into her the way light settles into a room, not all at once, but completely. She looked around the garage again, really looked this time, at the worn edges, the careful hands, the quiet pride that existed without display. Then she did something no one there expected, not because it was dramatic, but because it was simple. She stepped closer to one of the cars waiting in line, rolled up the sleeve of her tailored jacket just slightly, and ran her fingers along the edge of the hood, not inspecting, not judging, just present. One of the mechanics watched, unsure for a second, then returned to his work, because whatever this moment was, it did not belong to spectacle. It belonged to understanding. As the sun dipped lower, the light shifted again, softer now, turning the space into something almost still, almost sacred in its quiet. Daniel moved back toward his workbench, picking up his tools with the same steady motion he had always had, because nothing about who he was needed to change for this moment to exist. And that was the point. Lily's laughter echoed faintly from the office doorway where she had come to wait for him, her small voice carrying a kind of joy that did not ask where it came from, only that it was there. Victoria turned slightly at the sound, her expression softening in a way no boardroom had ever required. "She is why you said no," she said, not as a question, but as a realization. Daniel glanced toward his daughter, then back at Victoria. "She is why I say yes to the right things," he replied. The distinction settled quietly between them, clear and unshaken. No one clapped. No one spoke. The world outside continued without noticing what had shifted inside that small garage. But those who stood there felt it, not as a victory, not as a transaction, but as something rarer. Respect that did not need to be earned through power. Grace that did not need to be announced. And a future that did not begin with a signature, but with a choice. As the last light of the day stretched across the floor and slowly faded, Daniel Hayes kept working. Victoria Hale stood without needing to lead. And in that quiet, unspoken balance, something lasting took root, the kind that does not demand attention, but leaves the world a little more still, a little more honest, and for a moment, beautifully silent.